The law called Vesper stolen property, but the scars beneath his collar told another story. An elderly woman had risked everything to keep him from the men who wanted him back. Then Navy SEAL August Merrick stepped between them and discovered that doing good was not the same as doing what was legal. To save Vesper, Gus would have to resist the one instinct that had guided his entire life, taking control. Because a frightened dog should never have to become evidence just to prove he was hurt. And sometimes love means opening your hand, even when every part of you wants to hold on. Stay with us, then share what you believe Gus should have done, and subscribe for more stories of courage and second chances. Bright Pine Crossing looked almost innocent beneath the winter sun. Fresh snow covered the roofs in smooth white layers, softening chimneys, porch rails, and the weathered signs above the old storefronts. Loops of golden lights still hung across Main Street from the holiday season, glowing faintly even in daylight. Beyond the buildings, the frozen lake reflected the pale blue sky so perfectly that it seemed less like water than a second winter suspended beneath the town. August Merrick had not remembered the place being so bright. Perhaps that was because he had spent most of his youth trying to leave it. At 46, Gus had returned with one duffel bag, a stiff right shoulder, and 6 weeks of medical leave he had no intention of enjoying. That morning, he had completed a remote physical therapy evaluation from the kitchen of his late uncle's cabin. The therapist had asked him to lift his arm, rotate it, rate the pain, and describe whether the numbness had improved. Gus had given accurate answers. He simply had not given complete ones. The shoulder was healing. The hearing loss in his right ear was manageable. What no one had asked was how a man accustomed to being useful was supposed to spend 6 quiet weeks measuring progress in degrees of motion. So he had made a plan: repair the cabin, replace the damaged roof boards, sell the property, report to Virginia on time. Plans were clean. Grief, uncertainty, and hometown memories were not. He walked through the old commercial district wearing a faded blue camouflage field jacket over a navy thermal shirt. The jacket had gone pale at the shoulders and elbows, but every button was fastened and every pocket closed. His matching trousers were tucked neatly above black winter boots. The uniform no longer carried insignia, rank, or name tape. Out here, it was simply durable clothing. Still, people noticed. An older man outside the hardware store gave him a second glance. A woman arranging a chalkboard menu paused as Gus passed. Neither recognized him, which suited him perfectly. He had nearly reached the hardware store when he heard a low sound behind the bakery. Not a bark, a warning. Gus stopped. The sound came again, quieter this time. It did not carry the wild rhythm of panic. It was controlled, almost economical, as if whatever made it understood that noise should be saved for when it mattered. He followed the narrow sidewalk around the side of the bakery. A woman sat beneath a striped awning where the brick wall blocked some of the wind. She was small and thin, wrapped in a chestnut-brown wool coat with a plaid patch stitched over one elbow. Her boots were wet to the ankles. A gray knit hat sat crooked over short white hair, and both hands surrounded a paper cup that had long since stopped steaming. Beside her sat a German shepherd. The dog was lean, but not weak. Black fur covered most of its back in an uneven charcoal saddle, while dark copper coloring ran across its chest, legs, and sides. Its right ear stood straight. The left had a small crescent-shaped piece missing from the outer edge. One rear leg rested at a slightly different angle from the other. The dog was not facing the woman. It faced the street. Its body had been placed with intention, shoulders forward, hindquarters close to her knees, every line of muscle arranged between her and anyone approaching. Gus did not look directly into its eyes for long. He let his gaze move across the scene instead. The woman's damp clothes, the empty cup, the frayed leather collar, the absence of a leash. Then he saw the chain. Only a few inches of it were visible before the woman pushed the broken length beneath her coat. Her movement was small. The dog noticed. Its head turned toward her for half a second, then snapped back toward the mouth of the alley. 2 men were approaching. They did not hurry. That was the first thing Gus disliked. One held a phone at chest height, the camera pointed forward. He was in his late 30s, narrow-faced and pale from the cold, dressed in a dark company jacket that looked too clean for field work. The second man was older and heavier through the chest. He wore gray training gloves and walked with the confidence of someone who expected space to be given to him. "Rexler," the younger man called. The dog's shoulders tightened. The woman's fingers closed around the cup so hard that the cardboard bent. "Rexler," the man repeated louder. "Come." The dog rose, no barking, no lunging. It lowered its head and moved one step forward until its body completely covered the woman's knees. Gus watched the phone. The younger man adjusted its angle, making sure the dog remained centered in the frame. That was when the situation became clear. They did not simply want the animal. They wanted a reaction. The heavier man took another step. The shepherd's lips lifted just enough to reveal the tips of its teeth. "Careful," the man with the phone said, though he sounded almost pleased. "Dangerous animal." The woman's face had gone still. Not calm, still. There was a difference. Calm belonged to people who believed they had choices. Stillness belonged to those trying not to give fear a shape. Gus removed his gloves. He did it slowly, without approaching, then tucked them into his jacket pocket. His bare hands remained visible at his sides. The dog's amber-brown eyes shifted toward him. Gus stopped several yards away and turned his body slightly, avoiding a direct challenge. He did not crouch. He did not offer a hand. Men who reached toward frightened dogs often claimed they were showing kindness when what they really wanted was obedience. "Ma'am," he said, keeping his voice low. "Do you know these men?" The woman looked at him then. Her eyes were faded amber, sharp despite the cold. "They know the dog," she said. "That wasn't what I asked." For the first time, something almost like humor touched one corner of her mouth. "No," she said. "I don't know them well enough to trust them." The heavier man gave Gus a tight smile. "This is company business." Gus glanced at the silver logo stitched over the man's chest. North Crest Canine Solutions. The name was familiar. He had seen it on banners hanging near the town square, listed among sponsors for the upcoming Winter Lantern Festival. "I'm Pierce Latham," the younger man said, still filming. "This is Benton Crowell. The dog belongs to our facility." The woman spoke before Gus could answer. "His name is Vesper." Pierce kept the phone trained on the dog. "His registered name is Rexler." Benton stepped closer. Vesper moved immediately. Not forward, sideways. The dog placed itself more squarely in front of the woman, adjusting its position to block Benton without reducing the distance to Pierce. It was not losing control, it was managing two threats at once. Benton raised one gloved hand. "Rexler, down." Vesper's growl deepened. The woman's hand emerged from beneath her coat and rested against the dog's left shoulder. Her fingers trembled, but her voice did not. "Don't." Benton took another step. Gus moved then. He did not come between the woman and the dog. He entered the open space between Benton and Vesper, stopping at an angle that allowed the shepherd to keep seeing both him and Eudora. "Your friend's recording," Gus said. "That's useful." Pierce frowned. "Useful for what?" "For showing you're the one closing the distance." Benton's expression changed. Only slightly, but enough. He was not accustomed to having his actions described while he was performing them. "This animal was stolen," Pierce said. "We have microchip registration and purchase records." "Then call the sheriff." "We already did." As though summoned by the words, tires crunched over packed snow at the alley entrance. A county vehicle stopped near the curb. Sheriff Lowell Bexley stepped out wearing a brown winter uniform coat with a cream-lined collar. He was broad-faced, silver-haired, and carried extra weight around the middle, but his eyes moved quickly. He noticed the phone, the dog, Gus's position, and the broken cup in the woman's hands before he closed the vehicle door. "No one moves closer," Lowell said. Benton lowered his hand. Vesper did not relax. The sheriff questioned each person separately. Pierce spoke in clean sentences about legal ownership, liability, and public safety. Benton said little. The woman gave her name as Eudora Finch, but refused to explain where she had found Vesper or why a piece of broken chain was hidden beneath her coat. When Lowell asked whether the dog had bitten anyone, no one could produce a victim. When he asked North Crest for original records or a court order authorizing immediate recovery, Pierce had neither. The sheriff looked tired before the conversation was halfway over. "Everyone comes to the station," he said. "We settle what can be settled there." At the station, the differences between paper and truth became more uncomfortable. Northcrest faxed copies of a microchip registration and a purchase agreement. Both listed the dog under the code NC-17 and the name Rexler. Both appeared legitimate, but they were copies. No warrant existed. No animal control officer had evaluated Vesper. No formal theft complaint had yet been processed against Eudora. Eudora sat at the far end of the room with Vesper pressed against her knees. Every time Benton shifted in his chair, the dog's right ear turned toward him. Lowell folded his hands over a small notebook. "Mrs. Finch, if this dog belongs to Northcrest, you need to tell me why you have him." Eudora looked at Vesper. "If you send him back," she said, "he will die." Pierce exhaled sharply. "That is an outrageous accusation." Lowell kept his attention on her. "What happened there?" Eudora's jaw tightened. "I said what I can say today. It was not enough for the law. Gus knew that. It was also not nothing." A county community coordinator named Nadine Farrow arrived 20 minutes later. She was a composed woman in her mid-50s with dark hair threaded with silver and a burgundy folder tucked beneath one arm. She spoke to Eudora without using the slow, exaggerated voice some people adopted around the elderly. Nadine found a temporary shelter bed. Then she learned the shelter would not accept Vesper. The dog had not attacked anyone, but its size, guarding behavior, and unresolved ownership made it ineligible. "Can the county kennel take him?" Gus asked. Nadine shook her head. "Not without animal control assessing him. That won't happen until morning." "And she won't go without him," Lowell said. Eudora gave him a dry look. "Congratulations, Sheriff. Your years of investigative training remain intact." To Gus's surprise, Lowell almost smiled. The decision formed before Gus welcomed it. He had a private property outside town, no neighbors within immediate distance, a secure mudroom, enough space to keep Vesper separated if necessary. More importantly, he had watched the dog for nearly 2 hours and had not seen an uncontrolled act, only restraint under pressure. Gus signed the temporary responsibility form. One night, he was required to keep Vesper on private property, present him for veterinary evaluation the next morning, and return for further questioning when requested. It was a simple commitment. Gus had made larger ones with less hesitation. Yet as Eudora rose slowly from her chair and Vesper placed himself beside her, Gus had the uncomfortable feeling that he had agreed to something no form had managed to describe. In the truck, Eudora sat on the passenger side while Vesper occupied the narrow space behind the seats. The dog pressed close to her shoulder, eyes fixed on Gus in the mirror. Snow-bright fields passed beyond the windows. After several miles, Gus asked, "Why does Northcrest want him back badly enough to follow you through town?" Eudora watched the frozen lake appear between the pines. "Some men aren't afraid a dog will bite them," she said. Her fingers rested on the broken chain beneath her coat. "They're afraid the dog remembers what they did." At the cabin, Vesper entered first. He inspected the kitchen, the dark hallway, the stairwell, and every open doorway. He moved with a slight hitch in his right rear leg, nose working constantly. When he reached the small guest room, he returned for Eudora and walked beside her until she entered. Then he lay across the threshold. Gus approached once with blankets. Vesper stood. He approached again with water. Vesper stood again. No growl this time, but no invitation either. Outside, evening turned the snow blue beneath the trees. Inside, the old cabin held 3 breathing creatures, each carrying a different reason not to trust shelter when it was offered. The house was no longer empty. That did not mean any of them had come home. Chapter 2. The house where 3 restless souls could not sleep. By the time darkness settled over the lake, the cabin had begun to reveal how little August Merrick had expected anyone to live there. The dining table was buried beneath measuring tape, screwdrivers, roofing nails, and folded sheets of sandpaper. 3 chairs were turned upside down against the wall because Gus had planned to refinish them. White dust covers hung over the furniture in the sitting room, giving the place the uneasy appearance of a house waiting for its owners to return from the dead. The refrigerator held mustard, half a carton of eggs, 2 bottles of water, and a jar of pickles that had belonged to his uncle. Gus stared at its contents while cold air rolled over his boots. Behind him, Eudora Finch said, "I've seen better stocked refrigerators in abandoned motels." I wasn't expecting company. No sensible man ever does. That's why women invented canned soup. She had removed her damp coat, but refused to surrender the green cloth bag hanging from her shoulder. Her gray hat sat on the table beside her, revealing short white hair combed carefully to one side. Without the coat, she looked smaller, almost fragile, though nothing in her expression invited that interpretation. Vesper remained near her left knee. The German shepherd had inspected the cabin without behaving as though it belonged to him. He moved through rooms the way a cautious traveler studied an unfamiliar map, stopping at narrow doorways and testing the air before crossing. He avoided the stairwell entirely. Twice, Gus saw him glance toward it and turn away. Now the dog watched Gus open 2 cans of tomato soup. His amber-brown eyes followed the metal lid, the spoon, the movement of Gus's right arm. He did not beg. He did not even look at the food for long. His attention always returned to Gus's hands. "There's a bed in the guest room," Gus said. Eudora inspected the soup pot as if it had personally offended her. "For whom?" "For you. I'm not sleeping in there. It's clean." "That's the problem." Gus turned from the stove. Eudora nodded toward the hallway. White blankets, clean pillows, a rug no muddy boot has ever touched. It's the sort of room prepared for someone who expects to be invited back. "You're here for one night." "Exactly." She said it lightly, but Gus heard the harder truth beneath it. People who expected to leave before morning learned not to disturb much. They folded themselves into corners, kept their shoes close, and left as little evidence as possible that they had ever needed shelter. Gus did not argue. He carried a folding cot down from the storage room and set it near the stone fireplace. Eudora watched him spread 2 blankets over it. "That shoulder is hurting," she said. "It's fine." "Then you make that face for decorative purposes?" Gus kept working. The joint had stiffened after the cold walk and the hours at the sheriff's station. Raising the cot had sent a dull burn from the top of his shoulder toward his neck, but pain was information, not authority. When he finished, Eudora tested the mattress with one hand. "I've slept on worse." "That isn't praise. It wasn't intended as praise." Vesper circled the cot once, then positioned himself where he could see both the front door and Eudora. He did not lie down. Gus divided the soup into 2 bowls and placed bread on the table. For Vesper, he found a clean mixing bowl, filled it with water, and set a second bowl nearby with 2 scrambled eggs and torn pieces of bread. The dog ignored both. Eudora sat before her own bowl. Only when she lifted the first spoonful did Vesper lower his head toward the food Gus had prepared. Gus noticed. Eudora noticed him noticing. "He waits," she said. "For permission? For proof." "Of what?" "That I'm eating too." Vesper swallowed quickly, but without the frantic desperation Gus expected. Every few bites, he paused to look toward Eudora. When she raised another spoonful, he continued. The cabin settled around them. Wood clicked inside the stove. Wind dragged powdery snow across the windows. Somewhere beneath the floor, old pipes gave a low groan. Gus sat opposite Eudora. "Start at the beginning." She tore a piece of bread in half. "People who say that rarely want the beginning. They want the part that explains why they should care. I signed responsibility papers for you and the dog. You signed for one night. That was enough for the sheriff to write down my name." Eudora dipped the bread into her soup. 4 months ago, she said, I was living in a trailer outside Priest River, Idaho. Her tone changed as she spoke. It did not become softer, but more precise, as if the facts needed careful seams. The trailer belonged to her, though very little else did. She had parked it at a long-term campground where the electrical hookups failed whenever the temperature dropped. She repaired hems and zippers for other residents, sharpened scissors, and occasionally fixed old sewing machines no repair shop considered worth the trouble. One October night, something struck the underside of the trailer. At first I thought a raccoon had decided to sue me for possession, she said. Then I heard breathing. She had taken a flashlight outside and found Vesper beneath the metal steps. He was thinner then. Mud had dried along his belly. His right rear leg bled from a cut near the hock, and a length of broken chain still hung from a leather collar rubbed raw against his neck. "He didn't come to me," Eudora said. "He came to the dark under the trailer. I happened to be living above it." She placed water nearby and went inside. By dawn, the bowl was empty. The next evening she left scraps of chicken. On the third night, Vesper allowed her to sit on the steps while he ate. "Why Vesper?" Gus asked. "He only came out after sunset. Evening prayer seemed too dramatic, so I shortened the idea." For 3 months, the dog remained with her. Eudora cleaned his wound, removed the broken chain, and slowly taught him that a raised hand might be carrying food instead of pain. He slept beneath the trailer at first, then beside the door, then finally inside during a freezing rain. Gus watched Vesper as she spoke. The dog had stopped eating. His head rested above his forepaws, but his eyes remained open. What happened after 3 months? A woman at the campground took his picture. Eudora did not blame her. The woman had believed she was helping locate a lost owner. She posted the photograph to a regional community page where someone recognized the crescent-shaped tear in Vesper's ear. 2 days later, a truck from North Crest arrived. "They showed papers," Eudora said. "Pictures, a microchip number. They called him Rexler." At the sound of the old name, Vesper's body changed. It happened so quickly that Gus almost missed the beginning. The dog's forelegs stiffened. His breathing stopped for 1 beat. His right ear pointed toward Eudora, while the damaged left ear folded back. Eudora immediately set down her spoon. "Vesper." The dog looked at her. "You're here," she said. Nothing in the sentence sounded like a command. It was simply a statement of location, repeated with the steadiness of something practiced many times. Vesper exhaled. He did not fully relax, but his chest lowered toward the floor again. The room had changed. Gus had asked for information. Instead, he had watched a name open an old wound. Eudora took another spoonful of soup, though her hand now trembled. "The men said he belonged to them," she continued. "They had documentation. They also had a catchpole in the back of the truck." "So you left?" "I waited until they drove away. Then I left." "You didn't call the police?" "I had just watched 2 men with stamped papers explain that the frightened animal hiding behind me was their property. What exactly was I supposed to report? That the paperwork made him shake? You could have taken him to a veterinarian." "I did." Gus leaned back. Eudora looked annoyed with herself for answering too quickly. "At a low-cost clinic in Spokane," she said. "They scanned the chip. North Crest was listed as the registered owner. A technician stepped out to make a call. Vesper heard the company name and tried to climb beneath a metal bench. You left before they came back?" "Yes." "That made you look guilty." "I was guilty." The answer arrived without apology. Gus's jaw tightened. "You crossed state lines with property registered to someone else." Eudora's eyes hardened. "There, you found the clean sentence." "It isn't a sentence, it's a fact." Facts are often cleanest after someone has washed the suffering off them. The edge in her voice drew Vesper to his feet. He did not move in front of Eudora. Instead, he stepped into the open space between her and Gus, body angled so neither person stood fully behind him. His head moved once toward Eudora, then toward Gus. Gus recognized the behavior from tense rooms and unstable teams. Vesper was not selecting an enemy. He was trying to interrupt escalation. The realization cooled Gus's anger more effectively than any argument could have. He lowered his voice. "How long have you been moving?" 6 weeks. "Where?" "Spokane, then a church shelter outside Coeur d'Alene. After that, wherever anyone let us stay dry." "How did you get to Montana?" "A truck driver named Emmett Holcomb." Eudora's expression softened slightly at the memory. Emmett was 63, widowed, and transported restaurant equipment between Washington and Montana. He had found Eudora and Vesper at a highway rest stop after the bus driver refused to let the dog board. Emmett allowed them into the cab after Vesper spent 10 minutes inspecting the steps and another 5 deciding whether Emmett's beard was a separate animal. "He saw the North Crest truck?" Gus asked. "Twice, once near Kellogg and again outside Missoula." "Would he confirm that?" "If he answers the phone." "Do you have his number?" Eudora tapped the green cloth bag beside her boot. Gus looked at it. "You carry evidence in a sewing bag?" I carry everything in a sewing bag. Pockets were designed by men who never needed medicine, thread, documents, and half a sandwich at the same time. The tension broke just enough for Gus to breathe normally again. Vesper returned to Eudora's side, but he did not lie down immediately. He watched both of them as though uncertain whether the storm had truly passed. Gus collected the bowls. He wanted to ask more. Why Northcrest had followed them so far? What exactly Eudora had seen? Why the broken chain seemed important enough to hide? But the woman had begun rubbing the center of her chest with 2 fingers, a small unconscious motion she stopped as soon as she noticed his attention. "Are you all right?" "I'm old." That wasn't the question. It's frequently the answer. She rose too quickly. The room tilted for her before it became visible to anyone else. One hand caught the edge of the table, the other pressed hard against her coat. Vesper stood. Eudora waved him away, though the gesture lacked force. "Just tired." Gus moved 1 step closer. Vesper blocked him, not aggressively. The dog simply placed his body across the path and looked at Gus, waiting. Gus stopped. "Fine," he said. "She sits down. I stay here." Eudora sank into the chair again. After a minute, her breathing steadied. She refused an ambulance, refused a doctor, and insisted that a warm room had made her lightheaded after too many nights in the cold. Gus did not believe all of it, but he did not force the issue. Later he banked the fire and left a glass of water beside the cot. Eudora lay down fully dressed, her green bag tucked beneath the blanket near her hip. Vesper settled across the doorway between the sitting room and the hall. Gus went upstairs. Sleep never came properly. The cabin made unfamiliar sounds around the people inside it. Boards contracted in the cold. Wind pressed branches against the roof. Twice Gus heard Vesper shift below. Sometime after midnight, a faint scraping reached the bedroom door. Gus opened his eyes. 3 slow sounds. Claw against wood. Then silence. He opened the door. Vesper stood in the hallway. The dog did not growl. He looked directly at Gus, turned toward the stairs, then looked back. Gus followed. Eudora was sitting partly upright on the cot, one hand gripping the blanket and the other pressed beneath her collarbone. Her face had lost its color. Each breath came shallow and unfinished. Gus was beside her before Vesper reached the fireplace. "Eudora." "I'm fine," she whispered. "No." He called emergency services, gave the address, then unlocked the front door and cleared the narrow path between the cot and the entrance. Vesper paced once, then returned to Eudora. He pushed his nose against the green bag beneath her blanket. Gus opened it and found medicine bottles, folded papers, a needle case, and a card listing an irregular heartbeat condition. The ambulance arrived 12 minutes later. The paramedics allowed Vesper to watch from the doorway, but would not let him enter the vehicle. Nadine met them at the small county hospital after Gus called the number on the temporary placement form. Vesper remained outside the emergency entrance. He sat in the falling snow beneath a yellow security light, staring through the glass doors. He refused water. He refused the bread Gus brought from a vending machine. He did not lie down, even when his injured rear leg began to tremble. Gus stood beside him. He did not touch the dog or tell him everything would be fine. Promises made for comfort were still lies when no one knew the outcome. Instead, Gus stayed. Nearly an hour later, Eudora appeared behind the glass in a wheelchair, arguing with a nurse about being kept overnight. Vesper saw her. His front legs folded at last. He lowered himself into the snow and released one long breath, as if he had been holding the entire night inside his chest. On the drive back to the cabin near dawn, Eudora sat wrapped in a hospital blanket. The doctor had called it exhaustion, dehydration, and a manageable episode of cardiac arrhythmia. She had been discharged only after Nadine arranged a follow-up appointment and Gus agreed to monitor her. Vesper sat pressed against Eudora behind the front seats. When Gus reached toward the dashboard to increase the heat, he saw the dog's eyes lift in the mirror. Vesper watched the hand move. Then he lowered his head again. It was not trust, but it was the first time Gus had entered the dog's guarded space without being asked to leave. Morning arrived without warmth. The storm had passed, leaving Bright Pine Crossing beneath a hard blue sky. Sunlight struck the frozen lake and threw white glare across the cabin windows, too bright for anyone who had slept badly. Eudora sat at the kitchen table wrapped in the hospital blanket she had refused to leave behind. According to her, it was not stealing if the nurses knew where she lived. According to Gus, that was not how stealing worked. According to Eudora, men who spent their lives writing rules rarely understood the difference between theft and efficient use of available resources. The argument might have become entertaining under different circumstances. Instead, Gus stood at the stove heating oatmeal neither of them wanted while watching the color in her face. She had been instructed to rest, drink water, and attend a follow-up appointment. She had agreed to all three in the hospital with the sincerity of a prisoner promising never to escape. Vesper lay beneath the table. He had finally slept after dawn, though even now his body remained arranged around Eudora's feet. One ear moved whenever Gus crossed the room. His right rear leg stretched slightly farther from his body than the left. At 9, Nadine Farrow called to confirm the veterinary appointment. At 9:10, Sheriff Bexley called to remind them that Northcrest expected the dog returned unless the medical examination produced grounds for temporary protective custody. At 9:15, Eudora pushed the oatmeal away. "I dislike days that begin with 3 people telling me where to go." Gus put the bowl back in front of her. "Eat." "That makes 4. Vesper lifted his head as Eudora took the first spoonful. Only then did he move toward his own bowl. Just noticed the ritual again, but this time it did not feel like devotion alone. It looked like responsibility reversed. The dog was measuring Eudora's survival before permitting himself to meet his own needs. The thought followed Gus all the way into town. Dr. Rhea Montrose's veterinary clinic stood near the edge of Bright Pine Crossing in a low cedar building with broad windows and a small fenced yard behind it. No barking greeted them when they entered. The waiting room had been cleared at Rhea's request, and the receptionist had dimmed the overhead lights. Rhea met them in the doorway to the examination hall. She was 43, slim and sharp-featured, with reddish-brown hair cut to her jaw and held behind one ear. Rectangular glasses framed gray-green eyes that took in Vesper's stance before settling on either human. A black stethoscope hung around her neck, one side of the tubing wrapped with a strip of red cloth. She did not say, "Good boy." She did not kneel and reach for him. "Which spaces does he avoid?" she asked. Eudora glanced toward the narrow hallway. "Those?" Rhea nodded as if the answer confirmed something rather than inconvenienced her. "Then we won't start there." She opened the side door to the fenced yard and led them around the building to a larger treatment room with an exterior entrance. There was no metal examination table in the center, only a rubber mat, 2 chairs, and equipment pushed against the wall. Vesper entered slowly. His claws clicked once on the threshold, then stopped. The doorway was wide enough, but his body tightened as though the frame had narrowed around him. He lowered his head and looked back toward the yard. Eudora did not pull the leash. Rhea sat on the floor several feet inside and turned her attention to a clipboard. "No one is waiting for him to perform," she said. "Let him decide whether the room is safer than the doorway." Gus watched the dog assess them. Vesper looked at Rhea, then at Eudora. His gaze moved to Gus last. For 1 second, Gus had the unsettling sense that the animal was asking whether the decision belonged to him. Gus stepped away from the entrance. Vesper entered. The examination took nearly an hour. Rhea began without touching him. She watched him walk across the room, turn, sit, and rise. She noted the shortened stride in his right rear leg and the way he shifted weight away from it after standing still. When she finally examined him, she worked in small stages. A hand near the shoulder, a pause, fingers along the ribs, another pause. Each movement waited for Vesper's breathing to settle before the next began. He tolerated contact along his back and chest. When Rhea's hand moved toward his neck, his lips tightened. She stopped immediately. "No collar removal from the front," she said. Eudora unfastened the old leather collar from behind, keeping her body beside Vesper rather than over him. The fur beneath it was thinner than the rest. Rhea separated the coat with 2 fingers. A band of thickened skin circled part of the neck, interrupted by small patches where the fur had grown back unevenly. "Pressure injury?" Gus asked. "Possibly, but not only pressure. She used a small light to inspect the skin. The pattern is consistent with prolonged use of a contact collar. There are healed lesions where electrical prongs may have rested. May have? Eudora repeated. Rhea looked up. I can tell you what the wounds resemble. I cannot tell you who caused them, when they caused them, or what device was used without records. The sentence disappointed Eudora so visibly that Vesper turned toward her. Rhea continued the examination. One rib had healed with a slight ridge beneath the skin. The right rear leg showed evidence of an old soft tissue injury and possible damage around the joint. A narrow scar beneath the fur on the left shoulder had changed the direction in which the coat grew. None of the injuries were fresh. None could speak. At last, Rhea brought out the microchip scanner. The small device made a thin electronic chirp when she switched it on. Vesper recoiled so quickly that the rubber mat folded beneath one paw. His tail tucked. His right ear stood rigid while the damaged left ear flattened. He backed toward the wall, eyes fixed on the scanner. Rhea turned it off. The room became quiet again. Eudora moved near him, but did not touch his neck. Vesper. He looked at her. Rhea placed the scanner on the floor and pushed it away with one finger. That sound means something to him, Gus said. It means fear, Rhea replied. Fear is evidence of experience. It is not evidence of ownership, location, or criminal responsibility. There was no cruelty in her voice. That made the limitation harder to reject. After several minutes, she used a different scanner with the sound disabled. She passed it along Vesper's shoulder while Eudora kept his attention. A number appeared on the display. Rhea copied it onto the chart, then entered it into the registration database. The result loaded. Registered owner, Northcrest Canine Solutions. Animal identification, NC-17. Registered name, Rexler. Eudora stared at the screen. Vesper did not understand the words, but when Gus glanced down, he saw the dog watching her face. That was the most unbearable part of the morning. The machine had identified him without knowing him. It had produced numbers, ownership, and a name capable of tightening his whole body. Rhea printed the record. The registration is active, she said. Legally, Northcrest has a documented ownership claim. And medically? Gus asked. Medically, he has old injuries, significant conditioned fear, and a strong attachment to Mrs. Finch. Is that enough to keep them from taking him? Rhea removed her glasses and rubbed the bridge with one thumb. It may justify delaying an abrupt transfer until an animal control evaluation. It does not prove Northcrest injured him. Eudora looked toward the window. So the wounds count, she said, but only if they remember who made them. Rhea's expression changed slightly. The wounds count. The law simply asks them to do work wounds cannot always do. By noon, they were back at the sheriff's station. This time, Preston Weil was waiting. He stood near the window with an attorney beside him, both men framed by the winter brightness outside. Preston was 44, clean-shaven and carefully composed, with dark blonde hair parted neatly enough to look untouched by weather. His blue-black training jacket carried the silver Northcrest emblem over the heart. Gray gloves were tucked into his belt as if placed there for a photograph. He did not resemble Benton. There was no physical challenge in his stance, no impatience in his face. His politeness seemed polished to the same degree as his black waterproof shoes. When Eudora entered with Vesper, Preston looked first at the dog, not with affection, with assessment. "Rexler," he said. Vesper froze. Gus felt the leash tighten in Eudora's hand. Preston did not repeat the name. He allowed the reaction to remain in the room, then turned to Sheriff Bexley. "As you can see, he recognizes me." "He recognizes something," Rhea said from behind Gus. "That is not the same conclusion." Preston's gaze shifted to her. "Dr. Montrose." "Mr. Weil." The greeting held the temperature of lake ice. Preston's attorney introduced herself and placed a folder on the sheriff's desk. It contained copies of the purchase agreement, vaccination history, commercial training records, and microchip registration. Preston remained standing while he spoke. "We are not here to criminalize Mrs. Finch. It is clear she formed an emotional attachment to an animal she found under unusual circumstances." Eudora's mouth tightened. She may genuinely believe she was protecting him, Preston continued. But belief does not override lawful ownership, and a defensive dog of this size presents a public safety concern when handled by someone in fragile health. He never called her a liar. He never raised his voice. He reduced her instead, carefully, gently, almost compassionately, from a person making a moral choice into an elderly woman confused by attachment. Gus understood then why Preston did not need men like Benton in every room. Violence was only one method of control. Language could close a cage without making a sound. "Vesper has not bitten anyone," Gus said. Preston gave him a courteous look. "Not yet." That phrase can be used against every dog alive. Not every dog has blocked trained staff from recovering company property. He blocked men who approached the woman he protects. Preston adjusted one sleeve at the wrist. That interpretation is precisely why trained assessment matters more than sentiment. Sheriff Bexley opened Rhea's report. Dr. Montrose found evidence of old injuries and conditioned fear. Preston did not flinch. Northcrest receives dogs from multiple breeders and prior handlers. Some arrive with behavioral issues. We document and rehabilitate them. "The registration shows Northcrest purchased him as a young dog," Rhea said. "Our records will clarify his history." "Then provide the complete medical and training records." The attorney intervened. "We will provide whatever is lawfully required." It was not a refusal. It was also not cooperation. Rhea described the neck lesions, healed rib fracture, rear leg injury, and reaction to electronic sound. She was precise about every limitation. She did not say abuse when she could only prove injury. She did not say Northcrest when she could only prove fear. Each careful word protected the integrity of her report. Each careful word left Eudora more alone. Preston listened with the patience of a man who knew uncertainty favored the person holding paper. When the discussion ended, Sheriff Bexley granted a temporary delay pending animal control review. Vesper would remain with Eudora and Gus for 48 additional hours. After that, absent new evidence or a protective order, the registered owner could reclaim him. Eudora said nothing. Vesper lay beneath her chair, chin resting across one boot. The clock on the sheriff's wall sounded louder than it had any right to. 48 hours. Gus had worked inside shorter windows. He had planned movement, routes, contingencies, entry points. His mind began doing it now. Northcrest sat 6 miles outside town on an old timber road. He could observe the perimeter before dusk, map the buildings, identify traffic, fencing, blind spots. "You're planning something illegal," Rhea said. They were standing outside the station when she spoke. Snowmelt dripped from the roof between them. Gus looked at her. "You read minds?" "No. I've met men who believe trespassing becomes reconnaissance if they stand quietly enough." "I only want to see the facility." "From where?" He did not answer. Rhea folded her arms. "If you enter their property, access records, photograph restricted areas, or provoke a confrontation, Preston's attorney will make this about you, not the dog, not the injuries, you. If there are animals being hurt, then careless heroics will give the person hurting them time to destroy evidence." The words landed harder than accusation. Gus looked toward the truck. Eudora sat inside with Vesper beside her, both figures visible through the glass. "You're asking me to wait. I'm asking you to understand that restraint is also an action." He almost laughed. Restraint had always been the time between deciding and moving. It had never felt like the movement itself. Rhea's expression softened, though only slightly. "I treated 2 other dogs registered to Northcrest," she said. "One came in with a torn paw and an owner who said the animal panicked whenever a remote control beeped. The other had cracked teeth and refused to cross doorways." "What happened to them?" "The injuries were treated." "That wasn't my question." Rhea looked out toward the sunlit street. "They went back." For the first time, her professional calm showed a fracture. Not guilt exactly, something worse, the memory of having followed every rule and still watched suffering leave through the front door. "Why didn't you report it?" "I did. There was no single injury that proved systematic abuse. Animal control inspected the licensed areas. Everything met minimum standards." Gus followed her gaze. Across the street, workers were hanging a silver North Crest banner above the route for the Winter Lantern Festival, a clean logo against clean snow. On the drive back, Nadine called and asked them to stop at her office. She had begun the process of replacing Eudora's expired identification card, correcting the address attached to her Social Security benefits, and finding emergency senior housing. Eudora sat across from Nadine's desk with her coat buttoned to the throat. "I need help with the dog," she said, "not with reorganizing my existence." Nadine, dressed in a burgundy cardigan with reading glasses hanging from a chain, did not look offended. "Your medication records are in Idaho. Your benefits are being mailed to a campground. You have no permanent address, and the hospital listed Mr. Merrick's cabin as your discharge location. I did not authorize my life to become a filing cabinet." "No," Nadine said, "but right now, every missing document gives someone else more power to decide what happens to you." Eudora's anger faltered. Nadine slid 3 forms across the desk, but kept her hand on them. "I can help restore your options. I cannot choose one for you. If you tell me to stop, I stop." The room remained quiet. Then Eudora pulled the first form closer. "Your pens are terrible." Nadine offered her another. "That one is worse." "Then we've identified our first crisis." By late afternoon, they stopped at the Morning Lantern for food. The diner glowed with amber light, its windows fogged above painted snowflakes. Iona Kress, the owner, brought coffee without being asked. She was a broad-shouldered woman in her early 50s, with dark curls pinned loosely behind her head and the brisk warmth of someone who had fed half the town through divorce, funerals, and frozen pipes. She placed a bowl of beef scraps near Vesper but did not approach him. "I heard what happened," she said. "In this town?" Eudora replied. "Impossible." Iona glanced toward the front window, where a North Crest Festival poster hung beside the door. "Truckers stop here late, delivery drivers too. Some of them have heard dogs behind the North Crest property after midnight." Sheriff Bexley, who had joined them to discuss the deadline, looked up. "Heard what?" "Crying, metal doors, sometimes engines after the place is supposed to be closed." "Names?" Iona wiped her hands on her apron. "That's where people become less courageous. Why didn't you tell me before?" Her eyes moved to the poster. "Because Preston pays for the winter festival. Because North Crest buys lunches for staff twice a week. Because knowing something feels different when saying it might cost your employees hours." No one accused her. That made her look more ashamed. Lowell opened his notebook. "Give me whatever names you have." After Iona left, the sheriff spoke quietly. 48 hours. That is the current hold. Without something more substantial, registration wins. Beneath the table, Vesper had fallen asleep with his body curved around Eudora's boots. Eudora's fingers rested in the fur behind his damaged ear. Gus studied them. If Vesper were returned, Eudora would not merely lose protection. She would lose the creature whose meals made her eat, whose walks made her rise, whose vigilance had become the rhythm around which she continued living. But another thought followed. If Gus decided that emotional need gave him the right to keep Vesper regardless of law, evidence, or the dog's own well-being, he would still be treating the animal as something humans could assign. Preston called it property. Eudora called it rescue. Gus was beginning to understand how easily love could become another claim of ownership when fear was allowed to speak for everyone. Outside, the afternoon light turned the snow gold. Inside, the clock above the counter moved forward 1 minute at a time. Vesper slept through it, unaware that every person around him was deciding where he belonged. The first crack in Eudora's story appeared in something as ordinary as a pair of pliers. Gus found them the next morning on the cabin's mudroom floor. They were small, old, and red-handled, the kind carried by someone who repaired zippers, lamp cords, or stubborn sewing machines. One jaw was nicked. A thin crescent of dark metal dust clung near the hinge. The green sewing bag lay open on the bench above them. Eudora stood at the sink with her back to him, rinsing a cup. Vesper rested near the stove, awake but still, his head turned toward both of them. Gus picked up the pliers. "These yours?" Eudora did not turn. "They have not yet learned to answer for themselves." "The chain." That stopped her hands. Water continued running into the cup. Gus set the pliers on the table beside the broken length of chain she had hidden beneath her coat on Main Street. He had seen damaged links before. The end was not snapped from force alone. One side had been crushed and cut. "You didn't just remove what was hanging from his collar," he said. "You cut him loose." Eudora shut off the faucet. The cabin became unnaturally quiet. Even the old refrigerator seemed to pause between its mechanical breaths. Vesper raised his head. "I told you I removed the chain," Eudora said. "You told me he appeared under your trailer already injured." "He did." "That wasn't the whole story." "No." The answer came without resistance, which somehow made Gus angrier. He had expected denial, evasion, another sharp joke designed to send the question elsewhere. Instead, Eudora dried the cup and placed it carefully on the counter. "Sit down," she said. "I'm fine standing." "That is rarely true when a man says it that way." Gus did not sit. Eudora did. Her movements were slower after the hospital visit. She lowered herself into the chair with one hand braced against the table, then rested both palms over the green sewing bag. Vesper rose and crossed to her side. "North Crest had a temporary training field behind the campground," she began. "Not the main facility, just an empty logging lot they rented for private evaluations." Gus said nothing. The absence of interruption made her continue. "On the night Vesper appeared, Eudora had been awake because sleet was striking the trailer roof. Near midnight, engines moved along the access road behind the campground. She assumed workers were unloading equipment until she heard a dog cry out. Not barking, crying. She put on her coat and followed the sound through the trees. The training field had been lit by portable flood lamps. From behind a stack of cut timber, she saw 3 men and 2 dogs. One dog remained in a crate. The other was Vesper. A padded man stood at the center of the field, protected by a heavy bite suit. Benton Crowell controlled Vesper with a long line, while another trainer held a remote device. "They made the man shout and rush him," Eudora said. "Vesper went forward when the man came at him. He caught the sleeve and brought him down." Her fingers tightened around the fabric bag. "Then the man stopped fighting." Gus understood before she said the rest. Vesper released. He held for a second. Then he let go and backed away. The response was exactly what many handlers claim to want: control, judgment, the ability to stop once the threat ended. But Benton did not reward him. He shouted a command. When Vesper failed to re-engage, the other trainer pressed the remote. Vesper collapsed against the line. Eudora had not understood the device at first. She only saw the dog's body seize and heard the short sound forced from his throat. Benton dragged him upright. The man in the bite suit remained on the ground, no longer moving aggressively. Vesper would not attack him again. Benton used the remote a second time, then he struck the dog across the ribs with a flexible training baton. Gus looked toward Vesper. The shepherd stood beside Eudora, but his gaze was fixed on the red-handled pliers. "Did they see you?" Gus asked. "Not then." "What happened?" Vesper pulled backward. Benton moved closer. The line wrapped around a metal stake, and something gave. The clasp failed, or the chain tore loose from the stake. Eudora had not seen which. Vesper ran blindly through the trees with part of the chain still attached. He found darkness beneath her trailer. She waited until the men's trucks passed twice through the campground searching for him. Then she crawled beneath the steps with food, a blanket, and the pliers. "He tried to bite you?" "He warned me." "That wasn't the question." "No, he did not bite me." Eudora had sat in the mud for nearly an hour before Vesper allowed her close enough to touch the chain. She cut through the weakened link, wrapped the metal in an old towel, and hid both dog and evidence inside the trailer. By sunrise, she had packed everything she could carry. "You knew exactly where he came from," Gus said. "Yes." "You knew they were searching for him?" "Yes." "And when Sheriff Bexley asked whether you had witnessed abuse, you said you couldn't explain." Eudora looked up at him. "Because I had trespassed, hidden their property, destroyed part of their equipment, and fled across state lines. You let me sign responsibility papers without telling me that. I let you sign for a frightened dog and an old woman who needed one safe night. You decided which facts I was allowed to know." Her eyes sharpened. And you decided in the alley that you understood the whole situation after watching for less than 5 minutes. That doesn't make lying acceptable. No, it makes both of us menaces in different footwear." The humor failed to soften anything. Gus felt the old instinct rising, the need to establish the facts, define the breach, identify what came next. Eudora had withheld information that could affect the sheriff's decision, his military record, and every legal step already taken. He had put his name beneath hers. He had done it believing he understood the risk. "You used me," he said. Eudora's face changed, not into guilt, into injury. "If I had walked up to you on that street and said, 'Good morning, I stole a $30,000 dog and crossed state lines with him,' how much of the next sentence would you have heard? That wasn't your choice to make. When people like Preston have papers, people like me survive by choosing which truth gets us through the next door." Gus stepped closer to the table. "You don't know what this could do to my career. And you don't know what returning him would do to his body." His voice rose. "I am trying to stop that." Vesper moved. He did not place himself in front of Eudora as he had in the alley. Instead, he paced into the open space between them, turned toward Gus, then turned toward Eudora. His ears shifted unequally, one forward and one pinned back. His breathing quickened. Gus saw the dog's attention catch on his shoulders, his hands, the hard line of his body, not on his words, on the shape of command. For one ugly moment, Gus recognized what Vesper was seeing, a larger man standing over a smaller person, anger filling the room before anyone knew where it would land. He lowered his hands, then his voice. "I'm not going to hurt either of you." Eudora's expression remained hard. Vesper continued pacing. Gus took one step backward and sat in the chair opposite her. The movement cost him pride, which was precisely why it mattered. "I'm still angry," he said. "You are entitled to be. You were still wrong." "Yes." The simple admission took some of the air from the fight. Eudora looked down at Vesper. "But I would do it again." Gus believed her. That was the problem. And perhaps, somewhere beneath the anger, the reason he had not yet asked her to leave. His phone vibrated against the table. Unknown number. He answered. For several seconds, no one spoke. Then a man said, "You need to stop asking questions about North Crest." Gus recognized Pierce Latham's voice. "Where are you?" "Not on the phone." "Then why call?" "Because Preston knows the old woman talked to the veterinarian. He knows Bexley asked for medical records." "Did you tell him?" A pause. "I didn't have to." Pierce gave him a location, a closed agricultural supply store near the rail yard, and a time 20 minutes away. "Come alone," Pierce said. "No. This isn't a negotiation." "It is if you want me there." Gus looked at Eudora. She watched him without asking who was calling. "I'll meet you in public," Gus said. "Morning Lantern, back lot." Pierce cursed softly. "Too many cameras." "That's the point." The call ended. Eudora's mouth tightened. "North Crest?" "Pierce." "Is he helping?" "I don't know." "Then assume he is helping himself." It was the most sensible thing she had said all morning. The back lot of Morning Lantern was bordered by delivery crates, snowbanks, and a dented grease container painted with a smiling coffee cup. Iona allowed Gus to use the storeroom entrance but did not ask questions. She simply left the exterior light on and remained inside where she could see through the small window. Pierce arrived 12 minutes late in an old sedan rather than a North Crest vehicle. Without the company jacket, he looked younger and less substantial. His narrow face was unshaven, and shadows sat beneath his eyes. He kept both hands in his pockets as though afraid they might confess something without permission. Gus stood near the light. Pierce remained near the darkness. "You were right about the collar," he said. "Rhea was right." "Whatever." "Tell her yourself." Pierce shook his head. "No statements, not unless I know what happens to me." "What did you do?" Pierce looked toward the diner window. "I handled records, medication logs, transport schedules. Sometimes I assisted in evaluations." "Assisted how?" "I held lines." "For Benton?" "For whoever was running the session." "Did you hold Vesper's line?" Pierce's silence answered. Gus felt anger return, colder this time. "Did you activate the collar?" No. Did you stop him? Pierce looked at the ground. No. Snowmelt dripped from the roof and struck a metal bucket with slow, hollow taps. Pierce began speaking faster. Northcrest used electronic collars above manufacturer recommendations. Dogs that failed aggression evaluations were sedated after sessions, so clients would not see post-training distress. Medical complaints were recorded as transport injuries or breeder defects. There was also a secondary kennel area listed internally as the recovery annex. It was not included in the public licensing map. "How many dogs?" Gus asked. "I don't know." "You worked there." "I worked in records." "You held lines." Pierce flinched. "I know some things. Not everything." "What do you have?" "Logs, names, dates." "Bring them to Sheriff Bexley." "Not until I have immunity." Gus studied him. Pierce wanted to believe the truth was a currency. He would exchange enough of it to purchase innocence. "That isn't mine to give." "You have influence." "I have no authority over a county investigation." "You're a SEAL." "Which means nothing here." Pierce laughed once bitterly. "It means people listen when you walk into a room." "Then listen now. If you participated, you may face consequences. Telling the truth does not erase what you did." Pierce stepped back. "So I give you everything and ruin my life? You already helped ruin theirs." The words landed. Pierce's face hardened to protect whatever remained behind it. "I knew you'd do this." "Do what?" "Pretend you're clean because you showed up late." Gus did not answer. Pierce was wrong about many things, not that. No one entered suffering with clean hands merely because they arrived on the correct side of it. Pierce returned to his car. "You get nothing," he said. He drove away. By afternoon, Preston's response had begun. The video appeared first in a Bright Pine Crossing community group. It showed Eudora kneeling near the campground trailer months earlier, cutting the chain from Vesper's collar. The angle came from a distant phone camera. The footage had no image of the training field, no baton, no shock collar, no fleeing dog. Only an old woman cutting metal and guiding a German shepherd inside. The caption described her as a transient who had unlawfully taken a valuable animal and concealed it across state lines. A second post questioned why an active-duty serviceman was using his status to interfere in a private property dispute. By evening, strangers had begun calling the cabin. Some wanted to support them. Others wanted to know whether Gus had threatened Northcrest employees. One man left a message saying people in uniform should obey the law instead of choosing which laws applied to them. Eudora listened to only half of it before turning off the phone. "I should leave," she said. "No. You do not get to issue that word and expect the world to organize itself. They want you to run. They want you discredited. I am already discredited. You are still salvageable." Gus had gone outside to split firewood, needing an action with a clear beginning and end. When he returned after dark, the folding cot was empty. The green sewing bag was gone. So were Eudora's coat and boots. Vesper stood near the front door. He looked at Gus once, then pushed his nose against the latch. Outside, Eudora had reached the end of the driveway. Snow fell in slow flakes around her, catching in the shoulders of her patched coat. She carried the green bag and walked with short, determined steps toward the road. Vesper ran after her. Gus followed but stopped at the porch. "Eudora!" She kept walking. Vesper reached her, circled once, then paused. Eudora continued toward the road. The dog took 2 steps after her, then he stopped again. He turned toward Gus. The distance between them was no more than 30 yards, yet it seemed wide enough to divide one life from another. Eudora looked back. Vesper stood in the middle of the drive, body angled toward her, eyes fixed on Gus. For the first time, loyalty had given him 2 directions. Gus wanted to go to them, take the bag, bring Eudora inside, decide the safest course before she reached the highway. Instead, he remained on the porch. "You can leave," he said. The words surprised all 3 of them. Eudora's face tightened. "I'm not keeping you here, but if you run now, Preston's version becomes the only story anyone hears. You may lose your career. That is mine to risk." "And Vesper?" Gus looked at the dog standing between them. He should not have to spend the rest of his life running because every human near him is afraid of losing something. Snow gathered along Vesper's back. Eudora looked down the dark road, then at the cabin. Gus did not call her name again. I gave her the one thing both he and Preston had nearly taken from her in different ways, the right to choose without being physically stopped. After a long moment, Eudora turned. She walked back slowly. Vesper met her halfway and moved beside her, not in front. When they passed Gus on the porch, Eudora said, "Do not mistake this for confidence in your plan. I don't have a plan. That is the first reassuring thing you've said." Near midnight, the phone rang at Morning Lantern. Iona called Gus. "Pierce is here," she said. "Back door. He looks like a man who has argued with himself and lost." Gus drove into town with Eudora and Vesper. Pierce stood beneath the rear security light holding a large brown envelope against his chest. His face was pale. Snow had melted into his hair. He handed the envelope to Gus but did not release it immediately. Inside were copied medication logs, transport dates, and a list of identification codes assigned to dogs transferred to something labeled Secondary Recovery Annex. The annex did not appear on Northcrest's license documents. "I'm taking this to Bexley," Gus said. Pierce nodded. "You'll have to give a statement." "I know." "You may be charged." "I know." His hand finally opened. The envelope passed fully into Gus's possession. Pierce looked through the window toward Vesper, who stood beside Eudora inside the storeroom. "I don't want anyone calling me brave." "No one has." Pierce almost smiled, though there was no humor in it. "I'm not trying to be a good man." He stepped back into the snow. "I just don't want to be the man who knew everything and stood still one more day." By 7 the next morning, the back room of Morning Lantern no longer looked like part of a diner. Iona Kress had cleared away boxes of coffee filters and spare syrup bottles, replacing them with folding chairs, legal pads, and a long table scarred by years of deliveries. Snow melted from boots near the door. The air smelled of cinnamon, wet wool, and the burnt edge of the first pot of coffee. Sheriff Lowell Bexley stood at the center of the room with his notebook open. Around him sat Gus, Eudora, Nadine, Dr. Rhea Montrose, and Pierce Latham. Vesper lay beneath Eudora's chair, his body angled toward the rear entrance. The brown envelope Pierce had delivered the night before rested on the table. No one touched it. Not because it was unimportant. Because everyone understood that papers did not become truth simply because a frightened man carried them through snow. Lowell removed one document at a time. Medication logs, transport schedules, lists of animal identification codes. Several entries had been marked with the abbreviation SRA. Secondary Recovery Annex, Pierce said. His voice sounded smaller in daylight. He had not slept. The skin around his eyes was gray, and he wore the same dark sweater from the night before. Without the Northcrest jacket, he appeared less like a representative of a company and more like a man who had spent too long mistaking employment for innocence. "Where is it?" Lowell asked. "Behind the licensed kennel buildings, farther uphill." "Why wasn't it on the inspection map?" Pierce looked down. "Because it wasn't called a kennel in the internal paperwork. It was listed as equipment storage." Rhea studied the medication sheets. "These sedatives were ordered in quantities far beyond what I would expect for routine veterinary transport." "Could they have another legitimate use?" Lowell asked. "Yes," she said. "That is why quantities are not enough. We need prescribing records, administration logs, and the name of the veterinarian authorizing them." Pierce shifted in his chair. "Sometimes there wasn't a veterinarian on site." "Sometimes?" Rhea asked. He rubbed both hands across his face. "Most times." Gus watched Lowell write. The sheriff did not react outwardly, but the pressure of his pen deepened until the nib nearly tore the paper. No single page proved everything. That was the difficulty, and perhaps the opportunity. One document could be dismissed as an error. One injured dog could be called an exception. One frightened employee could be described as bitter. But a pattern did not require perfection. It required pieces that fit. Lowell closed the folder. "We verify every part before I take this to the county attorney." Pierce looked toward the window. "How long?" "As long as accuracy takes." "There are dogs up there now." And if we move too early on bad evidence, Weil closes the annex, relocates the animals, and claims harassment. Pierce's mouth tightened. Gus recognized the same frustration that had been burning in him since Rhea stopped him from going to North Crest. Waiting felt immoral when suffering might be continuing, but acting badly could protect the people causing it. That was the cruelty of evidence. It often demanded patience from those least able to afford it. Iona entered with coffee and a tray of biscuits. "No one solves corruption hungry," she said. "Hungry people become dramatic." Eudora accepted a biscuit. "Some people manage drama on a full stomach. I was thinking of you specifically." For the first time that morning, Pierce looked almost surprised by normal conversation. Then Lowell began assigning calls. Rhea would pull the complete records of the 2 North Crest dogs she had previously treated. Nadine would contact the county shelter and determine whether any surrendered animals carried matching identification codes. Iona would reach out to the drivers who had mentioned noises and overnight traffic. Gus was given the task he disliked most. He was told to stay with Eudora and Vesper. "I can make calls," he said. Lowell capped his pen. "You can also become the most useful distraction Preston Weil has ever been given. I'm not planning to visit him." "That sentence is not reassuring when you say it." Eudora leaned toward Pierce. "He has the face of a man who believes rules are obstacles placed by less competent people." Pierce gave a weak nod. "I've worked for one of those." Gus looked at both of them. "This room is becoming unproductive." "No," Iona said. "It is becoming honest." The first useful confirmation came from Emmett Holcomb. He answered on the 4th call from a truck stop outside Bozeman. His voice carried through the speakerphone beneath the low thunder of diesel engines. Emmett was 63 and sounded permanently amused by the failures of machinery and mankind. He confirmed picking up Eudora and Vesper near Coeur d'Alene after a bus driver refused them passage. "I wouldn't call that dog friendly," he said, "but I've met friendly men I trusted less." He remembered the North Crest truck because it appeared first near Kellogg and again outside Missoula. At the second stop, 2 fellows came over asking if the old lady had stolen something valuable, Emmett said. "Didn't say dog, said something." "What did you tell them?" Lowell asked. "That my cargo manifest was private and my coffee was getting cold." "Would you provide a formal statement?" A pause followed. "Will it help her?" "It may help establish that North Crest was following her across state lines." "Then send me whatever I need to sign." After the call ended, Eudora stared at the table. "You never told him what happened?" Gus asked. "I told him enough to let us ride. He still agreed to testify." Emmett has always had a weakness for lost causes and terrible roadside pie. The second confirmation came from a pharmaceutical delivery employee named Marjorie Pike, who had worked the North Crest route the previous winter. She remembered repeated orders for canine sedatives because the quantities forced her to use a larger insulated container. The invoices listed the licensed main facility, but twice she had been told to unload near a service road behind a separate structure. She had assumed it was storage. Lowell asked whether she could identify the location on a satellite map. She could. By noon, a local electrician named Warren Sykes arrived at Morning Lantern carrying a folder of old invoices beneath his arm. He was in his late 50s, with a narrow face, white eyebrows, and 2 fingers missing from his left hand after an industrial accident years earlier. He had installed heaters, floodlights, and an upgraded electrical panel in a building behind North Crest. The invoice said tool warehouse, Warren explained. But warehouses don't usually need 12 individual heated bays, drainage channels, and washable wall panels. "Why didn't you question it?" Lowell asked. Warren shrugged without pride. "They paid on time." That sentence stayed in the room, not because it was unusual, because it was too ordinary. One person had heard dogs and stayed silent because she feared losing business. Another had delivered drugs and trusted the labels. Another had wired a building and accepted the description printed on an invoice. Lowell had received scattered complaints and filed each beneath a separate date. No one person had protected North Crest. Dozens of small decisions had. At one point, Lowell left the table and stood near the back door, staring at the snow piled against the alley wall. Gus joined him. "You had reports," Gus said. It was not an accusation, though it could not avoid sounding like one. Lowell nodded. One about late-night transport, 2 noise complaints, a report of a dog loose on Timber Road, Ria's referrals. You inspected the licensed buildings and believed what you saw. I believed what I could document. His jaw tightened beneath the gray mustache. I told myself that was professionalism. What do you call it now? Lowell looked back through the window at the papers spread across the table. Comfort. The answer surprised Gus. Lowell continued before he could respond. Preston employed people, sponsored the festival, kept merchants happy. Every complaint was small enough to explain away. I treated caution as if it had no cost. He returned to the table and opened an older notebook. Inside were dates, license plate descriptions, and names from complaints he had once considered unrelated. When he placed them beside Pierce's transport schedule, several dates aligned. The room went still. That was the moment the case changed. Not because a hidden confession appeared, because Lowell's old notes, once too weak to matter individually, gave the new records a history. Ria leaned over the pages. These 2 dates matched the dogs brought to my clinic. Pierce pointed to a third. That was a transfer night. Lowell drew a slow line connecting the entries. Outside, workers were hanging fresh banners for the Winter Lantern Festival. North Crest's Silver Mountain logo appeared at the center of every one. Preston was not retreating. He was preparing to perform innocence in public. While the others continued comparing records, Eudora became unusually quiet. At first, Gus assumed she was tired from the long morning. Then he noticed how carefully she avoided standing. When Iona asked whether she wanted more tea, Eudora answered without looking up. Vesper rose beneath the table. He nosed the green cloth bag beside Eudora's boot, caught one strap between his teeth, and dragged it toward her knee. Eudora tried to push it away. Not now. Vesper brought it back. Gus watched her fingers press briefly against the table's edge. You're dizzy. I'm seated. It is difficult to fall from a chair with dignity, but not impossible. How long? She gave him an irritated look. Nadine answered from across the table. Since she arrived. Eudora turned on her. Betrayal has become very fashionable. Nadine did not apologize. Ria checked Eudora's pulse and asked several direct questions. The episode was mild, but it was another sign that dehydration, inconsistent medication, and exhaustion were taking a toll. Vesper remained beside the green bag. He did not understand what medicine was. He only knew that when Eudora became still in a certain way, the bag usually opened, water appeared, and eventually her breathing improved. Gus watched the dog's concentration. All morning they had spoken about Vesper as evidence, victim, registered property, and witness without language. Yet Vesper was also performing the daily work of keeping Eudora alive. And Eudora was failing partly because Gus had allowed the investigation to consume everything else. He had asked what North Crest had done. He had asked what she had seen. He had asked what she had hidden. He had never asked what would happen to her once the fight ended. Later, while the others made calls, Gus sat beside her near the diner's front window. What do you want after this? Eudora frowned. After lunch? After North Crest. Her expression changed. No one had asked the question before. Not in that form. I do not know whether we win. That wasn't the question. She recognized her own words and gave him a reluctant glance. I don't want to stay in your cabin forever. I didn't assume you would. You arranged the cot, the medicine schedule, the food. Men like you can turn temporary arrangements into permanent orders without noticing. Gus accepted the criticism. What do you want? Eudora looked toward Vesper, who rested beneath Iona's coat rack. A room with a door I can close. A window. Enough space for a sewing table. People who bring me torn sleeves because they think I can still fix something. You don't want to live alone. I did not say that. You described neighbors. I described customers. The distinction mattered to her, so Gus let it stand. Nadine joined them with a brochure. Pine Thread House was a subsidized senior residence on the north side of town. It offered private rooms, independent living, weekly nursing visits, and a shared craft room maintained by the residents. Eudora looked at the photograph of smiling elderly people around a quilting frame. They always make everyone smile in these brochures. It is deeply suspicious." "There is an emergency room available," Nadine said. "You would pay a portion of the rent from your benefits. Nothing is final unless you visit and agree." "I am not moving into a place where old people wait politely for death." Iona, passing with a tray, stopped. "My grandmother lived there 8 years. Eudora looked up. She spent every Friday night cheating at cards and accusing the laundry machines of political bias. Death had to wait because she was busy winning quarters. A laugh escaped Eudora before she could prevent it. The sound was brief. So was the fear that followed it. "I will look," she said. "Looking is not agreeing." Nadine handed her the brochure. "That is generally how looking works." By late afternoon, Pierce sat alone with Lowell and a county investigator who had arrived from Helena. He gave a formal statement on record. He admitted holding Vesper's line during one evaluation. He admitted seeing Benton activate the electronic collar after Vesper had released the bite. He admitted recording injuries as pre-existing when he did not know whether that was true. No promise of immunity was made. The investigator explained that cooperation could be considered, but responsibility would not disappear. Pierce signed anyway. His statement, combined with the records, witness confirmations, Ria's medical files, Lowell's earlier notes, and the unlicensed structure identified by Warren, was enough for Lowell to request an emergency administrative inspection. Not a raid, not an arrest warrant. A lawful inspection, based on suspected animal welfare and licensing violations. The request went to a judge before sunset. Gus received his own official message shortly afterward. His reporting date in Virginia remained unchanged. 3 days. He read the notification twice, though the words did not alter. Eudora found him outside Morning Lantern beneath strings of unlit festival lanterns. "Well?" she asked. "Virginia in 3 days. You hoped they would delay it." "I hoped I wouldn't have to ask." She stood beside him, holding the Pine Thread House brochure under one arm. "Perhaps this is the first fight you must leave before knowing who wins." "I hate that." Eudora smiled, tired but genuine. "Then you are finally learning to live like the rest of us." Across the street, another Northcrest banner unfolded in the wind. Behind them, Lowell waited for a judge's decision. Nothing was finished. For once, Gus could not force the ending closer. He could only help place the pieces where others might finally see the whole. By noon, Bright Pine Crossing had become a town made of light. Lanterns shaped like stars, pine cones, and small winter houses hung above the square. Sunlight flashed against the snow, while strings of amber bulbs glowed beneath shop awnings. Vendors sold hot cider, wool scarves, and maple pastries from wooden stalls. Children were absent from the story of that day, but the town still carried the restless energy of adults eager to believe they had gathered for something harmless. At the center of the square stood a raised demonstration platform bearing the Silver Mountain emblem of Northcrest Canine Solutions. Preston Weil had chosen his animals carefully. The dogs brought into public view were strong, clean, and steady. Their coats shone. Their collars were new. Each one sat beside a handler with the controlled stillness of a statue waiting for permission to breathe. No frightened dog from the recovery annex appeared. No scar was visible from the edge of the crowd. Preston stood beneath a white canopy in his blue-black training jacket, speaking into a microphone about discipline, public safety, and loyalty. He made every word sound generous. "A reliable protection dog," he told the audience, "must respond without hesitation. Trust comes from consistency. Safety comes from control." Applause moved through the square. Gus stood near the back with Eudora and Vesper. He had argued against coming. Eudora had insisted. "I have spent 6 weeks being moved out of places before anyone could look at me properly," she had said that morning. "Today, I would like to be visible on purpose." She wore her chestnut coat, the patched elbow carefully brushed clean. Her cream scarf was wrapped twice around her throat, and the green sewing bag hung at her side. Vesper stood close enough for his shoulder to touch her knee. He had been unsettled since they entered the square. His nose worked constantly. His right ear moved toward the loudspeakers while the damaged left remained tilted back. He did not pull away, but his weight stayed ready to retreat. Gus kept the leash loose. He had learned that tension traveled both directions. At the edge of the crowd, a few people recognized Eudora from the video. Some stared openly. Others lifted phones. A man near a cider stand whispered something to his companion, then looked away when Gus met his eyes. Eudora noticed. She raised her chin. "Do not frighten them," she murmured. "I'm standing still." "You stand still aggressively." On the platform, one of the North Crest dogs completed a controlled pursuit exercise. A padded assistant rushed across the demonstration area. The dog chased, seized the protective sleeve, and released at the handler's command. Preston praised restraint as though North Crest had invented it. Gus felt Eudora's hand tighten on Vesper's leash. Then a handler near the platform raised a silver electronic whistle. The sound was thin and sharp. Vesper reacted before Gus fully heard it. His body dropped backward. The leash snapped taut for 1 second, then went loose as Gus stepped with him rather than pulling against him. Vesper's breathing changed into short, violent bursts. His eyes searched for an exit, but found legs, booths, and raised phones in every direction. The crowd noticed. A woman backed away. Someone said, "That's the stolen dog." More phones lifted. Preston stopped speaking. For one suspended moment, the square offered Gus exactly what they had been struggling to obtain: a visible, undeniable reaction connecting Vesper's fear to North Crest equipment. He could keep the dog there, let the cameras record, ask Rhea to explain, force Preston to answer in front of everyone. It would be useful. That was the thought that frightened Gus most. Useful was how men justified turning pain into material. Vesper twisted toward the narrow space between two vendor stalls. His claws lost purchase on packed snow. Gus moved in front of the nearest phones, not the dog. "Give him room." "He recognizes the whistle," someone called. Gus did not answer. He guided the leash toward the quieter side street without tightening it around Vesper's neck. Eudora walked beside the dog, repeating the same words she had used at the clinic and in the cabin. "You're here, Vesper." The dog stumbled once. "You're here." Behind them, Preston resumed speaking. His voice followed them down the street through the loudspeaker, smooth and unchanged. Gus led them around the corner of an old pharmacy where the buildings blocked the sound from the square. The alley opened into a small service lane lined with clean snow and stacked wooden crates. Vesper pressed himself near the brick wall. Gus stopped several yards away. He lowered the leash to the ground but kept one boot lightly over the handle so Vesper could not bolt into traffic. No command, no demand for eye contact. Eudora sat on an overturned crate despite the cold. Vesper paced between them, panting. For several minutes, none of them tried to improve the scene. The dog's fear was not a performance that needed a satisfying conclusion. It came in waves. The first was violent. The second left him trembling. By the third, he could look at Eudora for more than a second. She held out her open hand, not toward his collar, toward the empty space beside her. Vesper approached. He lowered his head against her knee. His breathing gradually lengthened. Gus remained where he was. Eudora looked over the dog's back at him. "You could have used that." "Yes." "Why didn't you?" Gus watched Vesper's sides rise and fall. "Because Preston already thinks fear is a tool." Eudora said nothing. The expression in her eyes was not gratitude. It was something steadier. Recognition. Across town, while North Crest performed control before an audience, 3 state vehicles turned onto the timber road leading to its facility. The administrative inspection order had been signed shortly after sunrise. Sheriff Lowell Bexley rode with 2 state animal welfare inspectors. Dr. Rhea Montrose followed in her clinic vehicle with medical supplies, transport crates, and 2 representatives from a court-approved rescue organization. The inspection was not secret, but its timing had been kept narrow. North Crest had received only the notice required by law. Benton Crowell met them at the main gate. He was already angry. He demanded to see every page of the order, then read each paragraph twice while workers moved behind him carrying boxes that had no reason to be moving that quickly. Lowell noticed. So did the lead inspector, a compact woman named Denise Carver, whose gray braid hung outside her state parka. She had the patient expression of someone accustomed to people mistaking delay for weakness. "The order covers all structures used for animal housing, treatment, storage, and training," she said. "The rear building is equipment storage," Benton replied. "Then the equipment will be inspected." The licensed kennels were clean. Water bowls were full. Floors had been washed. The dogs in those rows appeared healthy, though several avoided the fronts of their enclosures when Benton passed. The records office was orderly, too orderly. Medication sheets matched the animals listed in the public kennels, but the total quantities did not match the delivery invoices. Rhea stood beside the cabinet and compared dates. "We are missing administration records." Benton folded his arms. "Those drugs were discarded after expiration." "Where are the disposal logs?" He did not answer. Behind the final licensed building, a service road climbed uphill through the pines. Fresh tire tracks marked the snow. At the top stood a long metal structure with no North Crest sign. Its paperwork described it as a tool and equipment warehouse. The building had floor drains, heated bays, washable wall panels, and barking behind the doors. Denise Carver looked at Benton. "Open it." He refused. Lowell stepped forward. "The order includes this structure. You don't know what is inside. That is generally why inspections involve opening doors." Benton's face darkened, but he produced a key. The smell reached them first. Disinfectant, urine, damp fur, and the chemical sweetness of sedatives. Dogs occupied individual bays along both sides of a central aisle. Some barked. Others retreated to the rear walls. Several wore electronic collars despite being inside locked enclosures. Rhea moved slowly. She found sores beneath contact points, untreated dental fractures, pressure wounds, and animals whose coordination suggested recent sedation. Dates written on kennel cards did not match the injury reports in the office. At the far end, 3 shelves held remote collars modified with non-standard battery units. One inspector tested the output. Her expression tightened. "These exceed the manufacturer's recommended range." Benton said they were customized for professional use. No one answered him. The final kennel held an older German shepherd with a graying muzzle and a clouded left eye. The dog watched the open aisle without moving. Its enclosure door was unlocked. A rescue worker opened it fully and stepped aside. The dog remained at the back. She placed food near the threshold. Nothing. She moved farther away. Still nothing. Rhea crouched several feet from the entrance and studied the dog's body. Each time its front paw shifted toward the doorway, the muscles along its neck tightened and it withdrew. She looked at the metal strip along the threshold. 2 contact points had been embedded into the frame. "They conditioned him not to cross without release," she said. The rescue worker sat on the floor outside the kennel. She did not pull the leash attached to the dog's collar. She did not call repeatedly. She placed one gloved hand palm down on the floor and waited. Minutes passed. The inspectors continued working around them. At last, the old dog approached. It stopped before the threshold. Its legs trembled. The door was open wide enough for freedom, but the body remembered pain more clearly than the eyes understood space. The rescue worker remained still. The dog extended one front paw. It touched the floor outside the kennel. Nothing happened. The paw stayed there. That was all. No dramatic escape. No sudden transformation. One paw across an invisible border. Rhea looked away briefly, not because the moment was miraculous, but because it was ordinary in the most devastating way. The door had opened before the dog was ready to believe in it. Back at the festival, Preston received a phone call while a Doberman completed an obedience sequence. He listened without interrupting the handler. Then he stepped away from the microphone. Gus, Eudora, and Vesper had returned to the edge of the square only after Vesper's breathing had stabilized. They stayed far from the speakers. Sheriff Bexley arrived 20 minutes later. He did not approach Preston quietly. The demonstration paused as Lowell crossed the snow toward the platform. Several people began filming. Preston descended the steps to meet him. "The facility is being placed under temporary suspension," Lowell said. "All animals are being transferred into protective custody, pending further evaluation." The crowd changed, not loudly at first. Confusion moved faster than outrage. Preston's expression remained composed. "On what basis?" "Unlicensed animal housing, record discrepancies, medication violations, and immediate welfare concerns. These are administrative interpretations." Then you'll have the opportunity to challenge them." Preston looked beyond Lowell and saw Eudora, then Vesper. His gaze moved to Gus last. "You have turned a professional training dispute into public theater," Preston said. Gus almost answered. "Eudora did first. You brought the stage." A few people near them heard. Preston ignored her. He faced the phones and spoke with measured clarity. "Northcrest uses specialized tools to produce dependable protection animals. Every method has a purpose. A dog expected to defend human life cannot be permitted to hesitate at the wrong moment." Rhea had returned from the facility and stood beside Lowell, her boots stained from the kennel floor. "What about Vesper?" she asked. "Was his hesitation the reason he was punished?" Preston's eyes settled on the dog. Vesper moved closer to Eudora, but did not retreat. "A protection dog does not have the right to decide who deserves to be bitten," Preston said. Silence followed. Preston appeared to believe the sentence defended him. Instead, it stripped the language of safety and discipline down to its true foundation. Northcrest did not train judgment, it trained obedience without conscience. By evening, the facility had been suspended. The animals were placed under temporary county guardianship and transferred to veterinary clinics, rescue partners, and secure foster sites. Preston, Benton, and other employees were not convicted that day. They were notified of investigations involving animal cruelty, falsified records, improper drug practices, and licensing violations. Pierce gave an additional recorded statement. His cooperation was noted. So was his participation. No one allowed him to hide behind the phrase that he had only followed instructions. That night, Morning Lantern filled with townspeople. It was not a victory celebration. Some came because they were ashamed. Others came because they wanted details. A few merchants quietly removed Northcrest signs from their windows and placed them face down beneath tables. Lowell sat with the state inspectors near the counter. Rhea answered calls about temporary placements. Nadine discussed emergency housing paperwork with Eudora. Gus sat near the wall with Vesper beneath the table. The dog was exhausted. His head rested across Gus's left boot while his body remained close enough for Eudora to touch. Iona brought 3 bowls of stew and a plate of sliced roast beef. Eudora took one piece of meat and held it near Vesper. He accepted it immediately. She frowned. "After everything we have survived, you still haven't learned the basic courtesy of pretending to refuse someone else's dinner." Gus laughed. Not the short, dry sound he used to interrupt tension. A real laugh. It came before he could control it and stayed long enough for Iona to turn from the counter. The room did not become silent around him. No one watched as though he had performed something remarkable. Conversation continued. Cups touched tables. Snow melted from coats near the door. For the first time since returning to Bright Pine Crossing, Gus sat in a crowded room without measuring the exits or wondering how soon he could leave. Nothing was finished. Vesper's ownership remained unresolved. The dogs taken from Northcrest had only begun their recovery. The investigation could last months. But beneath the table, Vesper slept with his head on Gus's boot. Across from him, Eudora ate without being reminded. And for one evening, uncertainty did not feel like emptiness. It felt like a place among other people. By the time the first hearing was scheduled, winter had begun loosening its grip on Bright Pine Crossing. Snow still covered the shaded side of the mountains, but the roads had turned dark with meltwater. Icicles fell from the roofs in bright, sudden pieces. Along the frozen lake, narrow bands of water appeared near the shore, revealing movement beneath what had looked permanent. Northcrest Canine Solutions no longer operated. Its license had been revoked pending the outcome of the criminal and administrative cases. The dogs removed from the property had been transferred into the custody of a court-appointed rescue organization specializing in behavioral rehabilitation. Some entered foster homes. Some remained under veterinary supervision. A few could not yet tolerate a person standing beside an open kennel door. Vesper remained where he was, doctor. Rhea Montrose had documented that another abrupt transfer might deepen his fear responses, so the rescue organization approved a temporary shared care arrangement. He stayed with Eudora during the day and occasionally returned with Gus to the cabin beside the lake. The arrangement pleased no bureaucratic form. It worked anyway. Eudora moved into Pine Thread House on a clear Tuesday morning. The building stood on the northern edge of town, a two-story structure of pale brick with dark green shutters and a covered porch facing a row of pine trees. It was neither luxurious nor bleak. The carpets had been chosen by a committee with questionable taste, and the hallway smelled faintly of coffee, furniture polish, and someone's lavender hand cream. Eudora inspected her room as if evaluating a business contract. There was a narrow bed, a private bathroom, a small closet, and one broad window overlooking the trees. Iona had found an old sewing table through a diner customer and delivered it before Eudora arrived. The table leaned slightly to the left. "So do I," Eudora said. "We shall compensate for one another." Nadine completed the housing papers, redirected Eudora's benefits, and arranged for a community nurse to visit twice each week. Eudora paid part of the rent from her monthly assistance, an arrangement she accepted only after confirming that no one could evict her for insulting the wallpaper. Within 3 days, 2 residents had brought coats to her room. One needed a real repair. The other had a loose button that could have been fixed in less than a minute, but remained for nearly an hour drinking tea and discussing the failures of her former husband. Eudora understood what was happening. She did not discourage it. Vesper adapted less quickly. During his first visits, he inspected every door and stood whenever footsteps entered the hallway. He slept between Eudora's chair and the room's entrance, never fully lowering his head. But Pine Thread House had no electronic whistles, no metal training poles, and no men demanding that he perform. The residents learned not to reach for his neck. They greeted Eudora first and let Vesper decide whether to approach. Gradually, his body stopped holding the entire building responsible for the past. At the cabin, his changes were smaller but more surprising. The first night he stayed there without Eudora, he paced from the front door to the guest room until dawn. Gus did not close him in or call him back each time. He left the hallway light on and sat at the kitchen table, repairing an old cabinet hinge. By the second visit, Vesper slept for 20 minutes outside Gus's bedroom. By the fourth, Gus woke to find one of his black gloves on the floor beside the bed. The other glove remained near the back door. Vesper had apparently begun relocating property according to a system known only to himself. "You're becoming a thief," Gus told him. Vesper looked away with the grave dignity of the falsely accused. Their walks around the lake also changed. At first, Vesper repeatedly looked behind them, searching for Eudora. Later, he began moving several steps ahead, stopping to investigate animal tracks or wind-blown branches before returning to Gus's side. He still startled at sharp electronic sounds. He still avoided narrow utility passages. But distance from Eudora no longer meant catastrophe. She had not become less important. He had simply learned that love could survive an absence of several hours. The rescue organization scheduled a long-term placement meeting 1 week before Gus was due to report to Virginia. Rhea attended as the evaluating veterinarian. Nadine joined Eudora, while Gus sat across the table beside a representative from the rescue organization named Amelia Ross. Amelia was a quiet woman in her late 40s with close-cropped black hair and a habit of reading every page before speaking. She did not describe Vesper as damaged or heroic. She discussed him as an individual animal with specific needs. "There are 3 reasonable options," she said. The first was placement at a specialized rehabilitation center where Vesper could remain under professional observation for several months. The second was adoption by an experienced family living in a low-traffic rural environment. The third was for Gus to submit an adoption application subject to behavioral and home evaluations. Eudora listened without interrupting. Gus did not. "He stays with her." Eudora turned toward him. Amelia folded her hands. "Mrs. Finch's bond with Vesper is not in question. We do have to consider long-term physical care, emergency planning, and his exercise requirements." "She saved him." "Yes." "He protects her." Eudora's expression hardened. "Stop." Gus looked at her. She spoke quietly, which made the words sharper. "You are discussing me as if I have left the room. I'm trying to make sure no one takes him from you. That is exactly what Preston said about ownership, that loving a dog gives a person the right to decide where he belongs. That isn't what I mean. It is what you are doing." The criticism struck because he could not dismiss it. Gus looked toward Vesper, who lay near the wall with his head raised. The dog watched the people around the table, waiting for tension to become direction. Eudora rested both hands over her green sewing bag. "I am 78 years old," she said. "My heart has developed opinions. My knees conduct private rebellions. Vesper needs miles of walking, not a woman who negotiates with the stairs. You manage him. Today." The single word altered the room. Eudora looked at Vesper. "My greatest fear is not being without him. It is falling one night and leaving him beside someone who will not wake up." Gus had no answer. She continued before sympathy could interrupt her. "I did not save him so he could spend the rest of his life afraid to lose me." The rescue representative allowed the silence to remain. No one rushed to make Eudora's decision sound noble. It was not noble to recognize the limits of one's body. It was painful. That was different. Gus looked at the application in front of him. He had believed refusing it was an act of respect. Now he understood that refusal could also be a way of avoiding responsibility while calling it loyalty. He picked up the pen. "I'll apply." Eudora nodded once. Vesper lowered his head. The evaluation took place over several days. Rhea observed Vesper at Pine Thread House, at the cabin, in the clinic yard, and during a quiet walk near town. She tested neither obedience under pressure nor aggression. She watched how he recovered from surprise, how he responded when Eudora left a room, and whether Gus recognized the difference between fear and refusal. Her final report was clear. Vesper was not suitable for military work. He was not suitable for protection training. He was not ready for therapy environments involving crowds, frequent strangers, or unpredictable touch. He required stable routines, gradual exposure, veterinary care for his injured leg, and a handler willing to respect his avoidance signals. Gus read every line. Rhea watched him finish. "You look disappointed." "I'm not." "Good, because he does not need a career." Gus glanced toward Vesper, who was lying in a patch of winter sunlight. "He needs a life." Rhea closed the file. "That is the first intelligent thing you've said without being forced." The cabin inspection passed. Gus had secured housing outside the Virginia base, arranged veterinary care, and confirmed that Vesper would not be brought into restricted military facilities. The rescue organization approved the adoption 2 days before his departure. On the final morning, light snow fell over Pine Thread House. No crowd gathered. Iona remained inside with coffee because Eudora had threatened to cancel the entire farewell if anyone turned it into a ceremony. Nadine stood near the hallway window and pretended to review paperwork. Gus waited beside his truck. Vesper stood with Eudora beneath the porch roof. He wore a blue-gray fabric collar bearing his name. The old brass buckle from his first collar had been attached beside the new tag. Eudora held the leash loosely, then she unfastened it. She did not place the handle in Gus's hand. Vesper looked toward the truck. Gus took several steps down the walkway. The dog followed. After 4 steps, Vesper stopped. He turned back. Eudora had not moved. Vesper ran to her and pressed his muzzle into her palm. She bent with difficulty and placed both hands against the sides of his face, careful to avoid the sensitive skin around his neck. For a moment, her forehead rested against his. "You were never the thing I owned," she whispered. "You were the life that stayed." She straightened and released him. Vesper stood between them. Eudora's eyes shone, but her voice remained steady. "Go on. I taught you how to stay. Perhaps it is his turn to teach you how to move forward." Gus did not call. He waited. Vesper looked at Eudora once more. Then he crossed the distance by himself. Months later, Virginia carried a different kind of winter. Snow came rarely near the coast, and when it did, it melted before noon. Gus worked at a naval training center, helping prepare experienced personnel for roles that required judgment rather than endurance alone. He lived in a modest house outside the base. Vesper lived there with him. The dog never became military property. He did not wear a service vest, enter training exercises, or demonstrate miraculous abilities around wounded men. After months of rehabilitation, Gus occasionally brought him to a small gathering for service members adjusting after extended assignments. Vesper lay beside Gus's chair and watched the room. Sometimes a man spoke, sometimes no one did. Gus learned not to fill every silence. Back in Bright Pine Crossing, Rhea established the Open Threshold program to help animals removed from abusive environments. Community donations paid for behavioral evaluations, temporary foster care, and veterinary treatment. Gus contributed part of the proceeds after the cabin sold, but his name did not appear on the program. Pierce completed the legal obligations imposed for his cooperation and participation. He began volunteering at the rehabilitation facility under supervision. No one called the work redemption. He cleaned kennels, prepared food, and learned to wait beside frightened animals without forcing them closer. Sheriff Bexley created a system linking animal welfare complaints by facility, date, and ownership rather than filing each report in isolation. Iona turned the first Monday evening of every month into a fundraiser at Morning Lantern. Eudora repaired the tablecloths. In early spring, a package arrived at Gus's house. Inside was a scarf made for Vesper. It was cream-colored, slightly crooked, and far too long. A line of uneven gold stitching ran along one edge. The note read, "Do not teach him to save the whole world. Let him teach you that returning is also a mission." Gus tied the scarf loosely around Vesper's neck. Outside, the final traces of winter were melting into the grass. Water moved beneath the gutters. Somewhere beyond the window, a bird began testing a song it had not used for months. Vesper circled once beside Gus's chair. Then he lay down. He did not face the door. He did not raise his head at every sound from the street. His eyes closed. An old woman in Montana had found a place where her hands were still needed. A sailor had learned that protection did not always require standing between someone and danger. And a dog who had spent years guarding every threshold finally slept without keeping watch. Not because the world had become harmless, because at last he trusted someone else to remain awake. Sometimes healing does not look like a miracle. Sometimes it looks like an open door, a patient hand, or the courage to let someone choose their own way forward. Vesper did not need to save the world. He only needed to learn that love could remain, even when people no longer stood in the same place. May this story remind us to be grateful for the quiet souls who stay beside us while we learn to trust again. Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more stories about courage, loyalty, and second chances. May peace find your home, and may no wounded heart in your life have to heal alone.